It's a real pleasure to be with you, to share my experiences and some of my thoughts about empathy. Empathy is a word that's often just thrown around. However, I'm not yet convinced that it's displayed as frequently as what it should be. So there's one thing that unites all of us in this room, and that is the fact that all of us are in the business of people. We're in the business of improving the lives of people. But how do we make connections with people? I'm going to put it to you, it's actually through empathy. So what are we going to cover off today? I'm going to try to address 3 questions for you. Number 1 is, what is this thing, empathy? Quite often it's confused with sympathy. Secondly, can we develop empathy? Or are you just born an empath and unlucky to the rest of you, and that's the way you go along? Okay? And I also want to just touch on why it's important, particularly in the digital age in which we live. So to start our journey and actually answer these questions, we're going to go back in time. And we're going to actually revisit a small place called the Cape of Good Hope, also known as Cape Town. And that's a city that I was born in. Okay? So why is the Cape of Good Hope important? Well, many years ago, in fact in the late 1400s, the merchant ships from Europe sailed across to the east to discover all the riches of the east itself. And on their way, they found refuge in the place called the Cape of Good Hope, where they could replenish the stocks for these arduous journeys and also just rest. So Cape Town, or the Cape of Good Hope, became a really important port. Over a series of years, Cape Town, the city of Cape Town grew, and South Africa as a country developed into a really rich history, a beautiful place. But as some of you may know, South Africa also has a dark patch in their history, and that dark patch is apartheid. And so for those of you who didn't study modern history at school, apartheid was effectively a legislated system of oppression and racial segregation. I grew up in South Africa during the time of apartheid, and actually, fortunately, also in the abolishment of apartheid. So let me tell a little bit about apartheid. The fact is that if you were a person of color, you had inferior education. You were deprived of social privileges. You were told where you could live. You were lawfully bound to only marry and partner up within your race. This is quite an absurd, really, environment, quite a shocking environment. However, I was very privileged because I grew up in a liberal household whereby my parents questioned this. Members of my family would discuss this abhorrent system in which we lived. And in fact, one of my uncles was on one of the wanted lists of the National Party who actually implemented apartheid for all his work on equality of education. But in order to actually enforce apartheid, the government also introduced the system of conscription. So if you were a white male, you were required to complete your military service. I completed my military service with a lot of conflict. I was here representing a system of which I had no allegiance to. So that's a little bit about me and a little bit of the context. The other part about the Cape of Good Hope, it was also known as the Cape of Storms. And I want to share with you an experience of one very stormy night in Cape Town. So we're going to go back in time to 1993. Some of you might not have been born, but please just roll with me on this. There we are. And it was a particularly stormy night in Cape Town. I'd actually just got home from work on a Sunday night, and a friend of mine called me and said to me, "Hey, are you going to go to St. James Church," which is a very liberal church at the time. And I kind of hummed and hawed, and I said, "No, it's howling wind, there's relentless rain, I really don't feel like going to church." But they literally pestered me because they wanted a lift. So I said, "Yes, okay, I'll take you, I'll go there. I'm not a member of the church, but I'm happy to go there with you." And we'd no sooner sat down to start the service. And this church was actually a large auditorium. And I recall sitting up on the right-hand side of this auditorium, and there was a stage in front of me down below. And just next to the stage, there were double doors, typical exit doors to any large hall. And the wind was howling, and these doors were banging. But about 20 minutes into the church service, suddenly the doors burst open. And immediately 3 small black objects were tossed into the auditorium. My military instincts kicked in, and I grabbed my friend and threw her to the ground. And immediately after that, there were 3 large explosions that raptured through the auditorium. This was followed by 2 men standing with automatic rifles and firing indiscriminately at the whole audience. This came to be known as the St. James Church Massacre. 12 people died, and more than 50 people were injured. This atrocity was carried out by 4 individuals from a liberation army that had grown really sick and tired of oppression. They had grown tired of apartheid and living under it. So once I'd got over the shock of actually having this life-threatening experience, I spent a lot of time, many months, just reflecting. And my questions centered around a couple of things. Firstly was, what had occurred in these 4 men's lives that had caused them to actually commit such a heinous act? The other question that I threw around was, what would I do if I was in their situation? Would I be desperate enough to create or to carry out such an act? Would I have such hatred for other people to carry out such an act? And the other part that I really reflected on was, how do I respond to this situation? Do I double down on the propaganda that was fed to me as a young person and saying that people of color have ill intent? Or do I actually respond to the situation with an open mind and an open heart and actually really try and understand their point of view? And I share this story with you because I think it actually really starts us off on our journey of what is empathy. And there's a clear difference between sympathy and empathy. So sympathy is a feeling of sincere concern. But empathy is actually actively stepping into someone else's shoes. And there's a clear distinction between that, and I'll touch on it a little bit later. Surprisingly, empathy is actually a verb. It's an action. It requires action. It's not an emotion, okay? It's an action. And I'll also talk to this a little bit later, that empathy is actually a strength. It can coexist with courage. Quite often, in organizations, people associate empathy with a weakness, with a lack of strength. But in fact, it's incredibly powerful. And actually, in my experience, it's been when you show empathy, that's when you really drive engagement and you make meaningful change. So we've defined empathy. Okay. So how do we develop this thing? And how do we actually display it? Well, probably not surprising, it actually starts with ourselves, yeah? So if you want to develop empathy, it really starts with emotional intelligence, okay? So am I curious about someone else's position? Was I curious about those 4 people that had carried out that attack? Yeah. Am I also self-aware enough where I can check my own biases? So I really had to spend some time and check my bias, because what I did have was empathy for them. However, I had no sympathy for them. In fact, I was actually pleased when they were brought to justice. Okay? However, I still had empathy for what they had experienced that had pushed them to do such a radical act. Okay? The thing is, when we're empathetic, we can act with grace, and we're in control of the situation, emotionally in control of the situation. However, if we don't self-regulate and we're not self-aware, we can enter a situation with anxiety and stress, and we're distracted. Our minds are somewhere else, and this actually blocks our ability to be empathetic, because we either have a bias in the background or we're distracted by something else. So if you want to develop empathy, it starts with you, and it starts with reflection. So how do you show empathy? How do you know when you're actually doing empathy? Yeah. So the first one is curiosity. You really have to ask questions, but not for the sake of asking questions like an interrogation. It's asking questions so that you can truly seek to understand someone else's point of view. Okay. And then you have to do something which perhaps most of us are not great at doing, and that's actually listen. And I mean truly listen. There was a beautiful quote that someone said yesterday on the stage. They said, you got to listen with the ears of your heart. Isn't that a beautiful expression? Listen with the ears of your heart. So you actually got to listen to what the emotion the person is expressing to you. And then you got to take some action. And this is an interesting thing as well, because some people will share an event with you or a challenge that they're going through, but all they want you to do is listen. Where others actually want some sort of support. They actually want you to take action. So it's important setting that up and saying, okay, well, would you like me to listen and support, or do you want some guidance? Do you want me to take some action? But when you actually are asking questions, you're listening, and you're taking some form of action, you are displaying empathy. You are doing empathy. So how does this relate to us in the digital age? So there's one figure up there, 40 billion worldwide. So that is the number of SMS, of text messages that are sent every day worldwide. 40 billion. Like, I was amazed when I actually pulled up this statistic. I was like, wow, okay, people have got like overused thumbs. It's quite interesting. But then the other part of it also is, let's talk about AI. Yeah, everybody chats about AI. So this is a bit of data out of the Neiman Journalism Laboratory, which is located in Harvard, Boston, Massachusetts. And it was actually published in October, so like literally fresh off the press. And what they really looked at, they said, okay, well, if you use generative AI, what are we actually using it for? So as little as in 2024, most of us were using AI to create memes or some sort of artwork or fun. Yeah, there was like, yeah, AI is just this cool creative tool. However, in the space of 1 year, we're now using AI to gain information. So think about that from your career perspective. There are people out there that are getting benefit from the therapies that you have taken to them that are actually using AI now to gain information and knowledge, either about that therapy or about that therapeutic area. They're probably no longer going to our perhaps over-invested corporate websites. Yeah, as Michael Barnett said yesterday, none of the physicians have actually read a PI. There's no surprise there. Yeah. So with this digital overload of 40 billion text messages just streaming throughout the world every single day, and people actually using alternate sources, there's obviously a risk for us, particularly for us who work with people. And so what's at risk, and how's that being displayed in the workplace today? So what we see is greater sense of isolation. Yeah? People are no longer bothering speaking to each other. I'll rather send you a text message. So put yourself in the situation where you're actually really in a challenging situation, and all of us are guilty of doing this, and I'll put my hand up first. I'm thinking to myself, man, I'm so busy, blah, blah, blah. I'll just send Matt a text message and say, hey, how are you? Is that displaying empathy? No. But imagine if I called Matt and said, hey, Matt, I know you're in a challenging time. How are you going? How can I assist you? So that's a challenge for all of us, yeah, in our busy lives, is actually pick up the phone if you want to display empathy. A text lacks context. It does not display empathy. You should use a text message to say, how are you going, what we're doing later today, etc. Are we meeting up for a drink? But it's not a place to really connect with individuals. The other side also, let's go to team meetings, yeah? And all our online presence now. It's all those non-verbal cues that you lack. All you see is from the chest up, yeah? So you don't have somebody's wearing their pajamas, their tracksuit pants, or slippers, or whatever. No one has any idea. But more importantly, you're missing those little verbal cues of body language. And that is almost the currency of which empathy is built on. Because it allows me to tune in my radar and say, I'm getting a sense that you're actually probably not in the optimal space, or perhaps you're not really understanding what I'm saying, or I perhaps am not understanding what you're saying. And then also the classic one, the displaced focus, yeah? So we're in meetings, on team meetings, And you watch somebody's eyes and they're like, and so what are they doing? They're doing this like absolute BS notion of multitasking. Multitasking does not exist in my view, okay? You need to be focused and diligent in one thing what you're doing, okay? So they're trying to do emails, but they're all still trying to participate in the call, yeah? Or you sit down in a social setting for a beautiful meal, and the first thing someone does, takes out their phone, puts it face up on the table. Where's their attention? It's not with you. It's at the phone. So these are just little micro snippets of how we display empathy, or perhaps how, if we do not display empathy, we get into the zone where we have increased social isolation. We don't read all the verbal cues, so our skills in reading the non-verbal cues actually get diluted. And we always have this fragmented focus. No one is actually present anymore. So hopefully I've convinced you that empathy is important in the digital age. Okay? So how do you know when you're actually building trust and psychological safety through empathy? Well, you'll hear people say like, oh my God, finally, someone understands me. I feel understood. Or people will say, thank you for finally listening to me. Then you know you're in the empathy hitting zone, yeah? When you're having an in-depth conversation with somebody and they're sort of glazing over, well, you're probably not in that empathy hitting zone. I said earlier that I'd also touch on how I think empathy is really a superpower for all of us. This is one of my favorite topics, is these difficult conversations. I don't believe in a difficult conversation. I do believe in honest conversations, though. Okay? Because difficult, just putting the label of difficult around it puts all these connotations around, oh, it's going to be intense, it's serious, we're all going to get anxious. And once I'm anxious, I can't display empathy. So let's just have an honest conversation. Okay? But before I have an honest conversation, what do I have to do? I've got to self-regulate. I've got to check my biases at the door before I even enter the conversation. Okay? I also have to continually regulate self-awareness, because if I'm present and I really want to understand, I'm not going to jump to judgments or conclusions. Okay? That'll allow me to act with grace and a sense of self-control, which then facilitates the interaction with the other person that you're speaking to. But there are also some boundaries to empathy, yeah? So if you have no empathy, what are you surrounded by? You're surrounded by mercenaries. Everyone's out for themselves and they don't give a clacker about anybody else, yeah? I don't think that's the most healthy environment. But on the other side of that same continuum, if you overtly empathetic all the time, you have like a hippie commune, yeah? Everyone walks around, man, this is the coolest place on earth. I don't know what the hell we're doing, but man, it's such a great ride, okay? So you got to somehow have that balance. And so the way in which you get that balance is maybe asking some of the questions of, what do you need from me? How can I support you in this? I'm not going to do it for you, but I can support you through this, whatever it is. And then once again, as I say, I'll circle back on, you have to listen and you have to be willing to act and do something about it. So you may be sitting there thinking, oh man, this is like pretty heavy work, yeah? This is a lot of effort. What's the reward? Okay? So let's go to some research. So what are the benefits of empathy? Well, what we do know is that empathy drives trust and psychological safety. And once you've got that within a group or within a team or an organization, suddenly magic starts to happen. People are motivated. They're more willing to express their creative thoughts and ideas because they know it's not going to get shot down. Their personal integrity is going to be held in place. You get this increased collaboration and communication across it. And funnily enough, you have less burnout and stress. Because what Dave was saying earlier is that you're not worried about what's happening above you or around you or below you. You're actually in the moment and you're focusing on what you should be focusing on. And surprisingly enough, top talent actually sticks around and they want to stick around. Or if you move, they probably want to follow you as well. So you've created some fellowship. Wow, I think that's a pretty good thing. What does it mean to our business? Well, if you're working with highly empathetic leaders, your engagement rate is probably going to get you in the Great Place to Work survey a big green tick. Yeah, you're going to be above that 75th percentile. Okay? But for those of you, and hopefully there's nobody in this room, or not working with empathetic leaders, well, your scores are probably going to be a little bit down, and you're probably not going to be up in that northern part of it where you feel engaged, motivated. Okay. There's also higher profitability associated with it. But I think the real important one, particularly for us as an industry, where we're at almost like some really innovative time, is that you'd have increased innovation. People are willing to bring radical ideas and thoughts that will help us evolve. So, let's summarize this journey. Number one is I hope that I've actually convinced you that empathy is an action. It is an action. Okay? If you take nothing away from this, please take that. Empathy is an action. We can all develop empathy. Yes, some of us are kind of born empaths, but if you over-exercise your empathetic skills, you'll probably walk around exhausted. Okay? But we can all build empathy. And so how do you do that? You've got to be curious about someone else's situation. You've got to be willing to stand in their shoes. You also have to have your own self-awareness. So, perhaps you want to do a little bit of work on self-awareness. It's an eternal journey of self-awareness. But you also got to take time to reflect. So on those drives home after a challenging situation that you've had at work, an honest conversation, that's the time to reflect. Maybe when you're walking on the beach, that's the time to reflect and try and understand the individual's point of view. And why is this important? Because this really builds trust, and it builds that safe environment. So the next time you're entering into a situation, be that personally or professionally, where you need to exercise empathy, I'll leave you with, I think, one of the most profound quotes, and that's from Maya Angelou. Okay? So this is true for all of us. People will forget what you said. People will forget what you did. But people will never forget how you made them feel. I'm at time. I thank you for your attention, and enjoy the rest of the conference.